nation's capital. And no, it's just wrong how we're doing it.
Chairman, I think it's insane if the gentlelady doesn't have an argument, but she's going to refer to me and some of my colleagues. We were from the Third Reich. This is insane. It's insane.
15-year-olds as a bunch of criminals?
It's insane. Do I look like a member of the Third Reich to you, Ms. Tlaib?
Please.
Is that what I look like to you?
You're the one taking your voting card.
Is that what you think? Is that what you think? Is that what you think?
No, that's unethical.
I think it's radical and I think it's insane. And I'll respect everything that you say. But to say something like that to myself and a lot of my colleagues is way out of line. It's way out of line. It's way out of line.
Regular order, Mr.
Way out of line.
Regular order.
That's okay. But it's okay, right?
That is not how it
goes. It's okay, right?
You hold yourself accountable before you talk about
Hold myself accountable. Hold your own self accountable. How about that? Hold your own self accountable. How about that?
Free DC and make sure you vote with your own voting card. Don't be giving it.
What you just witnessed wasn't some aberration, wasn't some deviation from the script, wasn't some unscripted moment of political theater that erupted out of nowhere, because this moment in the House Oversight and Government Reform Committee, hearing about crime and the federal crackdown in the nation's capital, is the distilled essence of something far larger and far more terrifying, something that threads through every decision this administration makes, and every word its enablers speak. And I need you to understand right now, as you're still processing the raw emotion of that exchange, exactly what happened here, because when Rashida Tlaib declared, "It's really important, we need to stand up against this fascist takeover," that's not a bad word, it's a fact. She wasn't being hyperbolic, and she wasn't engaging in rhetorical excess, because what we're watching in real time, Trump deploying the National Guard to help local law enforcement address crime in the capital city, and if you think that sounds innocuous, then you need to recalibrate your understanding of what authoritarianism looks like in its nascent stages, because fascism never announces itself with goose-stepping parades on day one. It arrives with law and order rhetoric, and the promise to clean up the streets, and the insistence that only through military force can we restore safety to our communities, and Byron Donalds erupting with that performative outrage, demanding to know if he looks like a member of the Third Reich, while the room descends into chaos, is itself a fascist tactic, because the point isn't to engage with the substance of what Tlaib said. The point is to weaponize identity and deflect from the actual policy discussion by making himself the victim, and you need to see through this immediately. Here's what Representative Donalds doesn't want you to examine, because the GOP lawmaker from Florida is currently attempting to usher 2 bills through Congress to help tamp down on crime, including one that he said would lower the age for juvenile sentencing from 25 to 18 years old. And if that doesn't send chills down your spine, then consider what it means in the broader architecture of carceral expansion and the school-to-prison pipeline that already devastates Black and brown communities. Consider how lowering sentencing ages functions as a mechanism for social control, rather than justice. Consider how this dovetails perfectly with the militarized occupation of Washington, D.C., that Tlaib was condemning, and now we're starting to see the full picture of what law and order actually means in practice, which is the systematic criminalization and suppression of populations deemed threatening to the established order. And this is textbook authoritarian governance wrapped in the language of public safety. The performance Donalds gave you, that incredulous repetition of "Do I look like a member of the Third Reich to you?" that weaponization of his own blackness as a shield against accusations of fascist collaboration, is a masterclass in bad faith argumentation, because fascism has never required racial purity among its foot soldiers. It merely requires willing enforcers of hierarchical violence, and the historical record is replete with examples of colonized peoples and marginalized groups who served as instruments of oppression under fascist regimes, because fascism is fundamentally about power, and who wields it and against whom. But let's go deeper, because there's another bombshell buried in this exchange that reveals the profound corruption at the heart of how our legislative process actually functions, and Tlaib's closing salvo cuts straight to the bone when she tells Donalds to hold your own self accountable, and screams, "Make sure you vote with your own voting card, don't be giving it to somebody else," because what she's referencing is the open secret of proxy voting abuse that has plagued Congress, and yes, it open secret in the House, that this de facto proxy voting most often occurs out of convenience when multiple lawmakers are huddled in the same House aisle, and one member is closest to the machine, but it also frequently happens when a member stays behind in the cloakroom, or runs to the bathroom, and Rep. Thomas Massie said this week, "On the floor, it's common." Meaning that members of Congress routinely hand their voting cards to colleagues to cast votes on their behalf. And this isn't some minor procedural irregularity, this is the fundamental corruption of representative democracy, because when you elect someone to represent you in Congress, you're expecting that person to show up and vote based on their judgment and their conscience, But instead what you're getting is a system where voting cards are commonly traded in the Republican cloakroom, and the votes that determine the course of this nation's laws and policies are being cast by whoever happens to be convenient at that moment. And if this doesn't enrage you, then you're not paying attention to what democracy actually requires, which is presence, deliberation, and accountability. The Republican Party's relationship with proxy voting is itself a study in cynical hypocrisy that reveals everything you need to know about their commitment to constitutional principles versus their commitment to power, because House Republicans condemned the policy as an outrageous and unconstitutional abuse, and they filed a federal lawsuit in May 2020 to challenge the legality of proxy voting. When Democrats implemented formal proxy voting procedures during the pandemic, they screamed about how this violated the sacred constitutional requirement that members be physically present to vote. They sued Nancy Pelosi, claiming this was the end of representative government as we know it. But now Mike Johnson in particular has been a vocal critic of proxy voting and argued in recent weeks that the practice is unconstitutional, telling CNN last month that while he has sympathy for new parents in Congress, the practice's unconstitutionality is an inescapable truth, even as members give their cards to their kids to vote for them on the floor, and this has been going on for as long as they've been there. According to Republican members themselves, and the sheer audacity of this position should take your breath away, because what they're saying is that formal, documented, transparent proxy voting with clear designations and public records is unconstitutional tyranny, but informal, undocumented, secretive vote trading in the cloakroom is just business as usual, and this double standard isn't an accident or an oversight. It's the deliberate construction of a system where rules exist to constrain political opponents, while the in-group operates with complete impunity. And here's where we need to connect these threads into the larger tapestry of democratic backsliding, because the proxy voting scandal, the militarization of D.C., the lowering of juvenile sentencing ages, the performative outrage at being called fascist while implementing fascist policies, these aren't separate issues. They're all manifestations of the same authoritarian impulse that has consumed the Republican Party. It is no longer controversial to speak plainly about the authoritarian shift of the Republican Party, led by Donald Trump. And when Biden described the extreme MAGA philosophy as semi-fascism earlier this year, hardly anyone blinked because the evidence has become so overwhelming and so undeniable that even mainstream discourse has shifted to accommodate what was once considered inflammatory rhetoric. And the reason nobody blinked is because Trump has referred to his opponents as vermin, who are trying to destroy America and to destroy the American dream, and claimed that immigrants are poisoning the blood of our nation, with Hitlerian overtones that have not gone unnoticed. And when a major political party embraces this kind of eliminationist rhetoric, while simultaneously working to criminalize dissent, expand carceral systems, and militarize civil governance, calling it fascism isn't hysteria, it's diagnostic accuracy. The exchange you just watched between Tlaib and Donalds is a microcosm of the larger battle for American democracy, because on one side, you have a representative willing to name what's happening, willing to use the word fascist even knowing the backlash it will provoke, willing to call out corruption even in the midst of chaos, and on the other side you have someone who benefits from the system performing outrage that you would dare to examine the system, Donalds told reporters. Obviously, in light of the assassination of Charlie Kirk, that's even more of a sore subject now than it ever has been, and I just find it to be reprehensible. Invoking political violence to silence criticism, which is itself a fascist tactic, because the implication is that calling out fascist behavior makes you responsible for violence against fascists, which creates a discursive trap where any resistance to authoritarianism becomes impossible. You'll be blamed for provoking the very authoritarians you're resisting. And this is how the Overton window shifts. This is how what was once unthinkable becomes normalized. This is how democracies die, not with a bang but with a series of procedural changes and rhetorical maneuvers that each seem justifiable in isolation, but accumulate into totalitarian governance. Let's examine the precise mechanism of Donald's deflection, because it's actually brilliant in its cynicism, and you need to understand how this works, so you can identify it when it happens again, because Tlaib called Trump's actions in D.C. a fascist takeover, and she was specifically referenced the federal crackdown in the nation's capital, which involves Trump federalizing D.C.'s police department and deploying the National Guard to help local law enforcement address crime. And this is a policy question about the appropriateness of military occupation of civilian spaces and the concentration of federal power over local governance, but Donalds immediately made it personal by taking her systemic critique of authoritarian governance and recasting it as a personal attack on him as an individual, and specifically as a black man, asking repeatedly, "Do I look like a member of the Third Reich to you?" which forces Tlaib to either back down or double down on what now appears to be a personal insult rather than a policy critique. And this is classic DARVO, which stands for Deny Attack Reverse Victim and Offender, where the person implementing harmful policy positions themselves as the victim of the person naming that harm, and it works devastatingly well because it shifts the entire frame of the debate from what is happening to how we're talking about what is happening, and suddenly the issue isn't militarized occupation of DC, it's whether Tlaib was rude to call it fascist. The emotional tenor of the exchange matters too, because notice how Donald's escalated to shouting, notice the repetition, notice the theatrical nature of his outrage, notice how he said repeatedly, "This is insane, it's insane, it's insane, it's insane, it's insane, it's..." And this repetitive, emotionally charged performance serves multiple functions simultaneously because first it makes him appear passionate and authentic as though his rage is so righteous it can't be contained. Second, it prevents any actual policy discussion because you can't have a substantive debate when someone is shouting over you. Third, it creates a moment of viral content that will be clipped and shared across conservative media as evidence that Tlaib is unhinged and radical and out of control, when in fact she's the one trying to have a substantive conversation about authoritarian governance, and he's the one disrupting that conversation with performative hysteria. And fourth, it establishes an emotional baseline where any serious discussion of fascism is treated as inherently inflammatory and beyond the pale of acceptable discourse, which means the fascist policies can continue unopposed because we've made it socially unacceptable to name them as such. Here's what Tlaib understands that too many liberals and progressives still haven't fully internalized, which is that fascism isn't coming, it's here, it's already operational in significant ways. She thinks it's really important we need to stand up against this fascist takeover. That's not a bad word, it's a fact, because she recognizes that the language we use to describe political reality shapes our ability to resist it, and if we're too polite, too cautious, too concerned with civility and decorum to call fascism by its name, then we've already lost because fascists don't play by those rules. They exploit your commitment to liberal norms while systematically dismantling the institutions that make those norms meaningful, and every time you pull your punch, every time you say authoritarian tendencies instead of fascism, every time you worry more about being accused of hyperbole than about the actual dismantling of democracy, you're giving ground to people who will never reciprocate your restraint and who view your politeness as weakness to be exploited. Tlaib refusing to back down, continuing to argue even as Donald screamed at her, ending with that pointed accusation about proxy voting. That's what resistance looks like in practice, and it's messy and it's confrontational, and it makes people uncomfortable, and that discomfort is exactly the point, because comfort is the ally of complacency, and complacency is the ally of fascism. And we need to talk about the specific content of what constitutes this fascist takeover, because the House Committee on Oversight and Government Reform held a hearing titled Oversight of the District of Columbia to discuss Trump's recent efforts to improve public safety in the nation's capital, and witnesses included D.C. Mayor Muriel Bowser and D.C. Council Chairman Phil Mendelson. So this wasn't some hypothetical debate about abstract principles, this was oversight of actual federal intervention into local governance, and Tlaib said, "We can't be passive right now. It's really important that we stand up against this fascist takeover," and went on to suggest that any mention of the city's crime issues was insincere and off base, because she recognizes that crime is being weaponized as justification for federal overreach just as it has been weaponized throughout American history, to justify the surveillance, criminalization, and violent suppression of black and brown communities. And if you know anything about the history of American policing, you know it emerged directly from slave patrols, and has always functioned as a mechanism for maintaining racial hierarchy through the threat and application of state violence. So when Trump federalizes the DC police and deploys the National Guard, it's not crime reduction, it's occupation. It's the assertion of federal military control over a majority black city that has no voting representation in Congress and therefore can't resist this takeover through normal democratic channels. The irony of DC being the site of this authoritarian overreach is almost too perfect, because Washington, D.C. residents pay federal taxes, serve in the military, participate in all the obligations of citizenship, but have no voting representation in the Senate, and only a non-voting delegate in the House, which means they are quite literally subject to taxation without representation, which we supposedly fought a whole revolution about. And this colonial relationship between the federal government and D.C. creates the perfect laboratory for authoritarian experimentation, because the residents can't vote out the people implementing these policies. And Tlaib chanted, free DC, and told Donalds to make sure you vote with your own voting card. Don't be giving it to somebody else. And Trump deployed the National Guard and took other measures to crack down on crime in Washington, D.C. in August, and violent crime fell in the city, relative to previous year, following Trump's crackdown, and you can already see how that narrative is being constructed where the military occupation is justified post hoc by crime statistics, as though the appropriateness of martial law is determined by its effectiveness, rather than by constitutional and democratic principles, and this is the authoritarian bargain that societies always get offered, which is safety in exchange for freedom, order in exchange for rights, and the crime statistics will say whatever the people collecting them want them to say. Let's talk about the proxy voting revelation more, because this is genuinely shocking if you sit with it. The House's rulebook includes language barring members from authorizing other people to cast their votes, and it specifically states no other person may cast a member's vote or record a member's presence in the House. So this isn't some gray area or ambiguous situation. There is an explicit rule against exactly what members regularly do, and the fact that this rule exists and is routinely violated with no consequences tells you everything about how our system actually operates versus how we're told it operates. Tlaib yelled, referring to the ghost voting that Donalds uses with other members of Congress casting his vote when he isn't present, and the term ghost voting is perfect because it captures the haunting of democratic institutions by the specter of representation without actual representation, the performance of legislative legitimacy, while the substance has been hollowed out and replaced with backroom convenience and cronyism, and this is corruption in its purest form, not the Hollywood version with briefcases full of cash, but the structural kind, where the system itself has been warped to serve the people operating it, rather than the people it's supposed to represent. The hypocrisy is even more profound when you consider that out of all Republican members of the House, 144 of 213 have designated a proxy to cast their vote at least once through December 10, 2021, and on average, Republicans voted by proxy 29 times, compared to an average of 54 times for House Democrats. So after suing to block formal proxy voting, after claiming it was unconstitutional, after positioning themselves as the defenders of physical presence and deliberative democracy, Republicans turned around and used the very system they claimed to oppose at rates that demonstrate it wasn't the principle they objected to, but rather the transparency and accountability of a formal system, and this pattern repeats across every domain of governance, where Republicans claim to oppose something on principle, but actually oppose the transparency that would reveal their own violations of that principle, because the goal isn't consistent application of rules. The goal is a dual system where rules constrain enemies and empower friends, and this is definitionally authoritarian governance, because in a democracy the law applies equally to everyone, but in an authoritarian system, the law is a weapon wielded by the powerful against the weak. We need to connect this to the broader scholarly understanding of what fascism actually is, because scholarly resistance to understanding the present historical moment in the United States as involving fascism is giving way to a view of fascism as a concept that is useful for scholarly analysis, and fascism is understood as both a general socio-political process and as a social formation that takes particular forms in different national contexts, and right-wing populism provides the emotive mobilizing bridge between right-wing conservatism and fascism, broadening the appeal of fascism and helping to transform it into a mass movement, and fascism entails a particular style of divisive politics that is functionally equivalent to the style of right-wing conservatism and blurs the boundary between them. And what this means in practical terms is that we should stop thinking of fascism as a historical phenomenon limited to 1930s Europe with a specific aesthetic, and start thinking of it as a mode of politics characterized by authoritarianism, ultranationalism, the demonization of outgroups, the cult of a strongman leader, the rejection of democratic norms and institutions, and the willingness to use violence to achieve political ends. And by that definition, what we're watching in the Republican Party and the Trump movement is absolutely fascist, and the fact that it looks different from Nazi Germany doesn't make it less fascist. It makes it American fascism, which takes the form that American political culture allows. The hearing we just witnessed is the collision of two incompatible worldviews, where Tlaib represents a politics that insists on naming oppressive systems and demanding structural change, and Donalds represents a politics that demands we never examine the systems themselves, but only argue about individual attitudes and intentions. And the reason this second approach is so effective at preventing change is because you can always find individuals who aren't personally bigoted, who don't consciously intend harm, who genuinely believe they're doing the right thing while still participating in systems that produce racialized violence and authoritarian control, and Donald's being black doesn't preclude him from implementing fascist policy any more than Clarence Thomas being black precludes him from dismantling civil rights protections from the Supreme Court, because fascism isn't about the demographic characteristics of its implementers, it's about the function of the policies they implement, and whether those policies concentrate power, criminalize dissent, militarize civil society, and construct hierarchies of who deserves rights and protections and who doesn't. The scholarship on contemporary American fascism is increasingly clear that as Trump continues collecting both GOP support and criminal indictments, the modern Republican Party seems to be sliding further into fascism, and an unwavering loyalty to Trump combined with an equally zealous dedication to undemocratic policies makes it clear that Republicans are less concerned with the rule of law than in grabbing and holding on to power, and this isn't partisan hyperbole, this is descriptive accuracy from people who study authoritarian movements professionally, and the warning signs are everywhere for anyone willing to see them, and whether we look at party-wide support for Trump, the fascist rhetoric of his primary opponents, or the anti-democratic policies implemented at the state level, it is clear that the Republican Party satisfies the characteristics of a fascist organization, and with the country facing a rise in right-wing political violence, there's a growing concern that Trump and his supporters will attempt to steal or disrupt the 2024 election, and it is essential that the mainstream media begin describing the GOP as what it is, and this is where we are, this is the fight we're in, whether we want to acknowledge it or not. Here's what makes Tlaib's stance in that hearing so crucial, and why it matters that she didn't back down even in the face of Donald's theatrical outrage, because Tlaib said during the House Oversight hearing, "We can't be passive right now, and that we're attacking a process, we're not attacking people here, and that it's really important we need to stand up against this fascist takeover. That's not a bad word, it's a fact." And this distinction between attacking people and attacking processes is politically sophisticated because it refuses the trap of personalizing systemic critique. It insists that we can and must examine the structural violence of governance, regardless of the individual people implementing it. This is exactly what makes the critique so threatening, because if the problem is just bad individuals, then you can replace those individuals and leave the system intact. But if the problem is the system itself, then you need transformation, not just personnel changes, and the people benefiting from the current system will fight tooth and nail to prevent that kind of examination, which is why Donald's immediately made it about him personally, rather than about the policies under discussion. The violence of what's happening can't be overstated, because when we talk about fascism, we're not talking about aesthetic choices or rhetorical styles, we're talking about a mode of governance that produces real violence against real people. Tlaib attacked her GOP colleagues for depicting Washington as a crime-ridden and dilapidated city, saying that's not the reality she sees on the ground, and she accused Republicans of merely parroting talking points they read about the city elsewhere, because she understands that the justification for military occupation requires first constructing a narrative of chaos and danger that makes occupation seem necessary and reasonable, and this is classic security state logic where you create or exaggerate a threat, and then use that threat to justify expanding your own power, and the population that live in the places you're occupying have their actual experiences erased and replaced with the narrative that serves power, and this is colonial logic applied domestically, where the colonized are denied the ability to speak their own reality, and are instead spoken for by those who would rule them. And here's the thing about calling it fascism. Here's why it matters that we use that word specifically, rather than euphemisms like populism or illiberalism or democratic backsliding, because fascism carries moral weight. It clarifies what's at stake. It connects the present to the historical record of where this kind of politics leads, and FDR's vice president used the term Americanized fascism to help people recognize that authoritarian tactics and threats were not merely a foreign concern, and what Wallace wanted Americans to understand is that fascist thinking can adapt itself to different moments and different countries, and American fascism is an infectious disease, and we must all be on our guard against intolerance, bigotry, and the pretension of invidious distinction, and this warning from the 1940s is directly applicable to our current moment, because fascism didn't end with World War II. It's a recurring pathology of modern politics that emerges whenever the conditions are right, which means economic anxiety combined with manufactured fears about demographic change, combined with the weakening of democratic institutions and norms, combined with the emergence of a charismatic authoritarian leader who promises to restore a mythologized past through the exclusion and domination of demonized outgroups. The proxy voting scandal that Tlaib threw in Donald's face at the end of the exchange is the perfect encapsulation of how institutional corruption enables fascism, because when the people making the rules don't follow the rules themselves, when the law becomes arbitrary and selectively enforced, when the basic mechanisms of representation stop functioning as designed, you create the conditions for authoritarian consolidation because people lose faith in democratic processes and become susceptible to strongman politics that promise to cut through the corruption and dysfunction, even though the strongman politics will inevitably produce more corruption and more dysfunction just concentrated in fewer hands. And the last major vote of the 1117th Congress on an omnibus spending package cleared the House, despite more than half of all members voting by proxy, and that's just insane. It clearly had gotten out of hand. According to congressional observers, and when more than half the members of Congress can pass major legislation without being physically present, you don't have a functioning democracy anymore. You have a simulation of democracy, a performance for public consumption, while the actual decisions are made elsewhere by whoever happens to be in the room. The emotional and intellectual work that Tlaib is doing in this moment cannot be dismissed or diminished because she's performing the essential function of democratic opposition, which is to name what's happening, to refuse the gaslighting, to insist on accuracy, even when that accuracy is uncomfortable. And to her eternal credit, Tlaib said to Donalds, "You hold yourself accountable before you talk about Washington, D.C." And when Donalds responded asking, "Hold myself accountable," Tlaib shot back, "Hold your own self accountable. How about that? Hold your own self accountable." And this is the kind of moral clarity we desperately need more of in our politics, because Donalds wants to lecture about proper decorum while routinely violating the rules of Congress through ghost voting, wants to implement authoritarian policy while claiming to be offended by being called authoritarian, wants to police Tlaib's language while his own party leader uses Hitlerian rhetoric about blood purity and vermin. And this kind of shameless hypocrisy can only be combated by people willing to call it out directly and repeatedly, without concern for whether it's polite to do so. The stakes of this moment extend far beyond one contentious hearing, because what we're watching is the normalization of fascist governance in real time, and every time someone like Donald successfully deploys the "how dare you call me a fascist" defense to shut down substantive critique of authoritarian policy, the Overton window shifts a little more toward accepting that policy as normal and unremarkable, and NewsNation host Chris Cuomo said that Tlaib should be censured after appearing to label Republicans fascists and attacking Donalds, and after the hearing Tlaib released a statement about the fascist takeover. Donald snapped back, leading to an intense shouting match, and Cuomo said on his podcast that Tlaib blatantly breached a House rule by hurling an ad hominem attack against her Republican colleague. And this response from even supposedly neutral observers reveals how effective the fascist deflection has been, because calling policy fascist isn't ad hominem, it's substantive political critique. But by framing it as a personal attack and demanding censure, they're creating a chilling effect where members of Congress will be afraid to accurately describe what they're witnessing for fear of professional consequences, and this is how authoritarianism consolidates, not through dramatic coups, but through the gradual criminalization of resistance and the normalization of the unthinkable. Every institution that could serve as a check on authoritarianism is being systematically captured or neutralized, and the fact that we're even debating whether it's appropriate to call fascism by its name shows how far we've already slid, because in a healthy democracy, you should be able to identify authoritarian movements when they emerge and organize collective resistance. But we've been so thoroughly conditioned to value civility over accuracy, decorum over truth, that we're paralyzed by the fear of seeming hyperbolic while the actual dismantling of democracy proceeds apace, and this is why Tlaib's refusal to back down matters so much, because she's modeling what resistance has to look like, which is uncompromising in its clarity about what's happening, and unapologetic about naming it accurately, regardless of the social cost. And we need thousands more people in positions of power willing to follow that example, because the alternative is acquiescence to the slide into authoritarianism through our collective failure to call it what it is and organize accordingly. This is the fight of our generation, and it's happening right now in hearing rooms and city streets and voting booths, and the outcome is not predetermined, but it requires recognition of what we're facing, which means rejecting the comfortable fiction that this is just normal political disagreement and accepting the uncomfortable truth that we're in a struggle against fascism for the soul of democracy itself.